Good morning. Welcome to the last of our workshops. My name is Greg Valdivino. I'm the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion here at the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce. And as I said, this is the last of our workshop, and we're excited to bring back two presenters who presented at our third workshop, and they did such a fantastic job that we had to bring them back. So this morning, we'll be discussing on demystifying people with disabilities in hiring practices. And they'll be sharing a list of myths about people with disabilities. So without further ado, I'd like to present our speakers today. First is Andy Traub, and he is the Vice President of Human Resources and Allied InclusionWorks with Allied Global. And Ms. Darla Wilkerson, and she is the Executive Director of Disability Inclusion of Greater Kansas City. So with that, I'll turn it over to them.
Great, thank you, Greg. Thank you for inviting us back. I appreciate being here. And Andy, I'll let you maybe start, just maybe tell a little bit more about yourself, and then I will, and I'll start our screen share here.
There we go. You got to turn off the mute button. That's number one. Good morning. My name is Andy Traub with Allied InclusionWorks, as Greg pointed out. Super excited to be a part of today's discussion. Certainly one that's very important. It's always fun when you actually get invited back, because maybe that's when you actually realize the first one was not a bad presentation. So anyway, thanks for the chamber and the opportunity to talk about some of probably the biggest myths that are out there about hiring people with disabilities.
Great. And again, I'm Darla Wilkerson, Executive Director for Disability Inclusion of Greater Kansas City. And I agree, getting asked back to present is always a nice indication that maybe some of the information that we shared last time, people are interested in hearing more. I don't know how many folks know about each of our organizations, but I thought I'd just share a little bit about Disability Inclusion of Greater Kansas City. We are an affiliate of National Disability In, and we have about 27 affiliates around the country, and all of us have the same mission in terms of we're a business-led organization that helps companies advance their disability inclusion efforts in the workplace and marketplace. And we do that in a number of ways, and information sharing is absolutely one of the most effective ways, and being able to provide information today, I think, is another indication of that. And just sharing about how some of the experiences that we have around disability inclusion helps others elevate their efforts.
Yeah, and Allied InclusionWorks is one of those, we're an organization within Allied Global Services, but Allied InclusionWorks is kind of, it's the first end-to-end solution for businesses to, not only get prepared, and we help in the preparation of hiring diverse candidates, not only individuals with disabilities, but also fair chance veterans and service disabled veterans. But it's also an organization to where we can help plug in talent. It's because we've created a very diverse talent pool in which companies can draw from. So it is really an end-to-end solution from the consulting to as well as the fulfillment side of things. So certainly excited and to talk more about the myths of today.
Great. So yeah, we want to share, just some information around some of the myths and point out facts. And Andy and I've prepared some things that we feel we've heard over the years in terms of our experiences that seem to be general kinds of myths, and we want to share some of those with you today. First, I wanted to just start with this disability inclusion process and talk about the categories that really make up the bulk of disability inclusion efforts. And these are pulled from the Disability Equality Index, which is a self-assessment tool benchmarking tool that National Disability In uses with companies, and we help our business partners prepare for taking that self-assessment tool. And these categories just really kind of encompass this whole inclusion process when we talk about disability inclusion. And leadership and culture, of course, is always a starting point. If we can think about these in terms of having buy-in at the top, you hear that probably a lot, but also thinking about our companies embracing a enterprise-wide disability inclusion strategy. And is there any kind of proof of that? Is there a written statement about disability inclusion that is a company-wide statement? And so some of those kinds of things fall under that. Also with culture and leadership, we see our companies embracing the forming of their grassroots efforts around employee resource groups or business resource groups. Some companies call them, affinity groups, or I've started to hear some companies refer to councils or committees around disability inclusion. And so that's another indicator of that culture and leadership piece. And then just looking at any kind of external hiring goals, have any of those things been set in terms of what is our effort? How are we going to measure our outreach and recruitment efforts? And then are there any executive teams? Are there any teams that are focusing on showing that support? And so those are some of the indicators that fall under that particular category. There's many more, but we don't have time to go into all of that. And then the enterprise-wide category, is there access enterprise-wide? And that really looks at the accessibility piece. And Andy and I will share some of those things when we talk about accommodations. But, is the accessibility for our facilities, for our buildings present, as well as our websites and our application process? And so under that category, those are things that tool looks at. And then the employment practices has to do with what is in place in terms of your health and wellness programs, your EAP programs, anything to do with outreach, policy. Those kinds of things are under that particular category. And then community outreach is just what it means, is looking at how are you reaching out to the community? How are you doing partnerships? When you think about doing this work, we need each other. No one organization can do this kind of work by itself. And so, for example, Andy's organization and our organization are in partnership, as well as we both are in partnership with the chamber. And so we're all in this work together. And then supplier diversity, again, is just what it means, is looking at those particular areas within your organization that you do have a supply chain department, and is diversity and especially disability inclusion a piece of that strategy?
Yeah, I think, just to interject real quick, these are categories that, in a way, it's like diversity and inclusion and disability inclusion. A lot of organizations think of it as it's about recruiting, right? And that's like, okay, let's just go hire some people with disabilities and we're going to be good. But in reality of the situation is there's a lot to be done. On the other hand, although this can seem daunting, everything requires one step, right? What's your next step? So don't try and tackle all this all at the same time. These are categories that allow us to kind of break down best practices in business and how we can talk about them. But in reality, at the end of the day, hopefully there's just one thing that you take away from what we talk about today to just start doing or to start identifying. But, to sit there and say, okay, let's go do that supplier diversity, or let's do culture and leadership. They're broad categories that encompass a whole lot of different steps. And so certainly with the partnership with the chamber, as well as, InclusionWorks and Disability and work very closely together. It's like, what is that next step, and helping identify what that is really one of the biggest pieces to a successful program. Is just start and don't try and do it all at once. So
good point, Andy. It's that just do something, right? Start somewhere. Good point. And so we're going to kind of nail down or drill down a little bit further into that category of employment practices. And so that's really where we're going to spend the bulk of our time with you today, and talking about the myths and misconceptions in each of these and sharing some facts. So, Andy, you're on mute. So yeah, we want to start with our first poll. And you can see the question there, myth or fact, job descriptions and job announcements do not have to be the same.
All right.
Okay, it looks like about 73% of folks that answered is answering that that is a fact, and about 25% that's a myth. And I think Andy's having a little difficulty with his mute. You're still on mute, Andy. Adam, I don't know. There we go.
How about that?
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so job descriptions and job announcements. So Darla pointed out that 73% say that it's a fact that they don't have to be the same, and that is correct. The biggest part is they do not need to be the same, but what they do need to do is they need to explain what the job is. Obviously, job descriptions are probably more of the more formal component to the job itself. This is one of those things that's like, okay, do you have a job description? We're going to talk, you know, it's got to be legal. It has to have the essential functions in there. It also has to have, you know, it really gets into the weeds. The job announcement is really how do you attract somebody to apply for that job. However, one of the things that we talk a lot about is making sure in the disability space that you really do put the essential functions into the job description themselves, right? I mean, that's, you know, that's a best practice, but being able to sit there and say, here's what the job entails versus an announcement that's so over the top with jargon and cliches and that sort of stuff that it really, you kind of get lost, like, what's the job actually do? And so I think that being able to have the job description nailed down, but make sure your job announcements also have at least some of the most important essential functions at least spelled out in there. And you can do it in a way that certainly is not dry or boring or whatever, but you can attract people to the job the same way.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think that too, Andy, tell me if you agree with this, that when we have the job descriptions that haven't been updated for, you know, the past 10 years or
Yeah.
so, and we have a job announcement that has, we hire an employee, they start to work, and somewhere along the line, they need an accommodation, but they're looking at the information that was shared on the job announcement versus the job description. And so there's discrepancy there many times because those job descriptions haven't been updated. So that could pose an issue if there's not some consistency there. Would you agree?
I think that there's, oh, completely. I think the one thing is that there's a lot of organizations who do a lot of hiring, but I think we get stuck with these job descriptions being either stuck in a book or on a shelf, but they just don't ever get updated. So, you know, I think, you know, Darla and I both worked with an organization that had hundreds of job descriptions and say, let's go update all of our job descriptions right now. That's not practical, right? But if you do post the job, that's a great time to reevaluate the job description itself versus sitting there trying to, you know, do them all in one big batch. But do make sure the announcement and the description are accurate because of the fact, like I said, some of it, the legacy component, you know, how many jobs anymore, unless you're in some sort of manual labor, are you having to, you know, lift 50 pounds?
Right.
You know, if you're in an office setting and you're an accountant, at one point in time, you had to lift banker boxes, right? Full of cards and paperwork. Well, not anymore. It's all digital. So just, I'd encourage you just to go back and and make sure the descriptions are right before you post. But Darla has a great point. Put an announcement out there, my description doesn't show up the same way. That's super confusing for candidates.
Yeah, and I think it helps us to, during this time of all what we experienced the last 7-8 months. I know for several of our business partners that I've visited with, they've taken time to look at these announcements and versus job descriptions, because now people are working remotely, and many companies are talking about continuing to allow those employees to work remotely if they choose to. And so updates are required. Even within the job title itself, we're seeing positions being posted with the job title and then the word remote next to that. So we're needing to make sure that that's also changed on the job description, not just the announcement.
I think
Right.
one of the last points on that one is, explain in the announcement kind of what the expectations are for the application process, right? I mean, be very clear about how to apply and what their expectations could be in terms of multiple interviews or, phone interviews or whatever, but anything more that you can put in there about what the process is versus just go to our website, apply, and then you enter the big black abyss. Give people an opportunity to understand what the expectations are going to be for that application process itself.
Excellent. All right, so the next poll, we're moving to the candidate screening position here on our roadmap. And we're asking, myth or fact, I can't find good qualified candidates.
Definitely something that we hear on a regular basis. So be very interested to see what the numbers come back.
Yeah. Okay, it looks about 80%, 81% myth, 19 to 19% fact. So interesting.
It is. I'm actually somewhat surprised because, like I said.
Yeah, not what we thought, huh?
Yeah, which is great. I mean, I'm glad you're able to find. I mean, I think if we asked the same question in February, we would have gotten the absolute opposite numbers, right? Because at that point in time, we had a labor shortage and it was very difficult. And now we have an excess amount of labor force. And who would have thought? I mean, literally it changed overnight. I would say the fact about that is one of the things Darla and I talk a lot about when we talk to companies is the fact that we need to change the way we look through our talent lens when we go out to talent pools. There are a lot of great talent pools that are out there, especially the individuals with disabilities pool. Honestly, I've been in HR for 25 years and talent acquisition, most of that. And there's, I had been doing recruiting for 12 years before I really understood that there is a great pool of candidates out there who have certain barriers to employment with their disability that honestly, there's some are easily overcome because it requires the business to be intentional about helping them overcome it. On the other hand, there are some considerable barriers that are out there for some individuals, but it's like, how do I look at talent versus, the stereotypical, just take John off the street type of talent. It's like, let's go find people who have proven themselves in situations, but they also have the business metrics. They have better attendance, better retention, and they even have higher productivity at times. So anyway, so I'm glad the numbers are where they're at. But like I said, 6 months ago, they would have been flipped.
Yeah, it's so true. I think just the situation we're in now, you're exactly right. I also think too, when you talked about I think you talked about the messaging piece of just a little bit, when we were talking about job announcements, sometimes it can be a big turnoff for people with disabilities if it's not clear about a company's inclusion efforts. And so this whole screening piece of attracting candidates, where do you find, qualified candidates? That messaging piece is real important. And I think people look for something that's just above and beyond that EEO statement. How is your company actually embracing inclusion? And does it include people with disabilities is part of what folks are looking for. If you want to be an employer of choice for people with disabilities, you have to communicate that. And so that's another strategy on how you're going to attract or how you're going to find those qualified candidates.
I think there's a trap that some businesses fall into, though, where it's like, hey, I'm a disability friendly employer. I want to hire individuals with disabilities. We went back to go back to the first slide that Darla talked about with the categories. Mm-hmm. It's not putting it out there to say you're a disability friendly employer. Like, yeah, we're good. Like, well, that can be very dangerous, because if you actually put yourself out there as a disability friendly employer and you don't have some of those things really ingrained, mm-hmm. especially when you're talking employment practices, it can be really bad PR, but also a really bad experience for your hiring manager, your bad experience mm-hmm. for the candidate. So being an employer of choice, don't put it out there unless you are.
Unless you are.
Right. But on the other hand, just because you want to be doesn't make you one. So there is intentionality that goes behind that messaging component. But I also want to go through, as you're looking through your candidate search, in disability employment, we have basically, it's a pretty simple strategy. It's the same job for the same pay with the same expectations, right? So if your job announcement and your job descriptions are synced up, your job description is going to basically say, what's my measurement for success? Make sure that is held for everybody, right? Don't lower a bar for anybody because they, it's like, well, come in and I want to hire you, but I don't think you can do half the job. So we're going to have you do half the job, and we're going to pay you the same job, same pay, and call it the same job as what everybody else is doing. It gets very messy very quick for everybody. So make sure it's the same job, same pay, same expectations when you're looking for your talent.
Yes, that's a crucial point. I think too, Andy, we talked a little bit about just making sure that we're looking for candidates that meet those minimum qualifications first off. If they meet preferred requirements for the job, then excellent, just like you would any other employee that you're trying to do outreach for, or applicant that you're trying to do outreach for. So we're looking at what people bring to the position, their skills, their abilities, not the disability, right? Even though we're trying to diversify our workforce, first and foremost, we're trying to make sure that we're hiring people that are qualified for our positions.
Yep.
All right, Adam, you want to bring up the next poll? We're going to move to the candidate search. So the question is, most people with disabilities do not have relevant experience. Myth or fact? Okay, it looks like 94% said myth. So, that's great.
All I gotta say is I'm glad I'm on this side of it, because some of those questions are thought-provoking, right? I mean, it's like, do they have relevant experience? And if I'm sitting there saying fact or myth, it's like, well, am I really counting their experience? Because they may not have had a job before. And I think I'm glad that those who are attending sit there and are looking at it through the right lens. But on the other hand, I know that everybody on this call represents an individual in your company. And I think that's a big piece of it, is the fact that being able to help your company understand what relevant experience is when somebody doesn't necessarily have a prior job is a big deal. And I know that's a tough sell when you're talking to hiring managers, because of the fact it's like, well, you know, they don't have a prior experience doing X, Y, Z. It's like, no, but look at their life experience, right? So a lot of our organizations have, you know, people have volunteer experience, and so they have different types of experiences. And so I'm thrilled with the number. That 90+% is fantastic.
Yeah, it's so important to think about the other experiences, like you mentioned, with volunteer kinds of experiences, any kind of community involvement. Maybe people have had some leadership types of things when they've been involved in certain things in the community, maybe in their church. Even hobbies sometimes can be in leadership kinds of roles. So yeah, let's look at all of those experiences that people bring. And then, you know, I try to encourage people when we're working with community organizations, gentle nudging, sometimes not so gentle nudging, to make sure that when you're assisting people to apply for a job, that they meet at least the minimum qualifications, because that really helps then to make a good fit or a good match. Is got to make sure that people are applying for positions, not just that they're interested in, but also that they have the qualifications for. So that really helps elevate that piece.
Yeah, I think the other part about it is that being able to have quote unquote relevant experience. You know, Darla and you and I talked about this the other day. It's, you know, we've had some hiring managers to sit there and say, literally, I do not know how that person will do the job. And they're trying to put themselves in that candidate's position. It's like, well, they've applied for the job. They say they can do the essential functions of the job, but I can't wrap my head around it. That's okay. It's not for us to decide on their ability to do things, because I've seen some amazing things that people have been able to do through their own ingenuity and innovation, that they figure things out. And so I just think it's something that we need to ask when we're having that conversation with people. It's like, you know, here's the essential functions of the job. Can you perform them? And how do you see that happening? And that's okay. You don't have to sit there and say, there's no way you're going to be able to do your job, but just ask. You know, I've had some people, you know, I had one lady that I worked with at one point in time. She had a condition where her arms weren't fully developed, and she wanted to do customer service. And I'm like, you know, okay, the hiring manager's like, this person cannot do customer service. I'm like, well, just ask her how she do it. So she did. They asked her, and she said, can you just put the keyboard and the mouse down on the floor? Well, she used her feet and did everything. She was actually well versed in Microsoft Office and could do everything with her feet. And it's like, okay, so that you didn't see that coming. But yeah, I think don't assume that you know how that person's actually going to do the job. The bottom line is, can they do the job, and they're held accountable to the same expectations.
Excellent point, Andy. All right, so I think we'll move on to the next poll question, Adam, about job coaching. It's kind of an in between the search and the interview. So job coaches are there to do part of the work for the person. Okay, it looks like about 94% say myth. 95% say myth.
Well, that's good.
That's good.
job coaches can breathe a sigh of relief.
Yes,
I think for a lot of people. Yeah, I think it's very good. There's a lot with job coaches. There's another myth that can happen is the fact that people believe that if you're an individual with a disability and you come to work, then you will that you have a job coach assigned to you, and that's not the case. Job coaching is only there for people who qualify for that type of accommodation. But I think there's one of the biggest parts about business is to understand how to work with the job coach. And so being able to have a line of communication, understanding the expectations for that job coach. And, you know, I think one of the biggest parts about it is the job coach is actually designed to fade away. They're designed to get the person up to speed. However, they can partner with you, your trainers, your training process, and being able to help that individual get over the learning curve as much as possible. But then they're designed to fade away. They're not there to be free labor, as we asked, and so thankfully, very few people said that they were. But it's designed to help you and your team get that person assimilated to be a contributing member and meet the minimum expectations for that job.
Yes. And I think too that setting expectations can be beneficial for any employer if they're going to be having that third party, that job coach come in to work with that individual for a little bit during the initial orientation and training piece. You know, like you said, hold that coach accountable and set some expectations. And sometimes Andy and I worked with a particular company that, you know, we really pushed that issue because we knew that was going to be important for people to realize that if someone does start with a coach and the coach isn't following maybe a certain standard of the company, you have the right to say something and you have the right to do something. So setting those expectations in advance can really help alleviate some of those things that may occur as you move forward with the coach on site.
Yeah, I think it's also important to understand, you know, for that job coach to really understand the job. So there are times when you might actually say, hey, you know, we have a fairly complex job, or come get to know us a little bit. And it's okay to have a job coach come in maybe before that person starts, so they can, you know, be a little bit ahead of that learning curve and understand what the role of that job is. Maybe if you do shift work, maybe they work a half a shift and get to see how it all gets put together. That's okay, right? I mean, they're not on your payroll. They're being funded by different means. But really to set that individual up for success we do whatever we can to get that done. I think the other part about it is, Darla, is, you know, a lot of companies right now are almost saying, hey, let's not even use the third party, but let's educate our own trainers to be job coaches. And I think that is a really great way for a business to, one, become that truly disability friendly employer, but it's also taking the people who know how to train the best, give them professional development, and then let them do what they do best, which is train people. And so I'd hope that more organizations can do that. I know that's kind of tough because usually trainers are also production people themselves. So, but I think that'd be great if companies can continue to look at that.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Andy. I think we're seeing that as being a best practice moving forward, that more and more companies are thinking about how internally can they support any and all workers, right? So whether they establish mentor programs or, you know, have the buddy system, so to speak, when any employee comes on, how do they orientate that person? And some people need a little more orientation and training than others, disability or not. And so I think it's just a natural fit many times for companies to look at internally, how can they provide coaching or mentoring as they bring on new employees. So I think those are really good points. Some may hire someone, you know, just for that particular role, or they may use someone who may be in a lead position already or a trainer position. The other thing too is don't be afraid to ask that coach if someone is saying they need a job coach and that's an accommodation for that person. Don't be afraid to ask that coach, well, what exactly are you going to be doing? You know, what kind of supports will you be providing? Because I think that's crucial to know. You don't want someone just saying, well, I'm here just in case. No. That's not a good answer.
Right.
So be sure they're clear on their reasons why they're there as well, because like Andy said, fading is something that needs to occur. They need to be, figuring out how to get themselves out of there as soon as possible.
I think the interesting part about it is, and we've heard more and more from companies, we mentioned earlier, disability employment is not just about recruiting, it's also about retention. So, only 17% of the individuals with disabilities were born with them, 83% acquire them somewhere along later in life. To have job coaches or people who understand training and the possibility of disabilities or accommodations or different ways to train people, I think that is a retention strategy for your current employees. Because the reality is, 25% of the U.S. population are individuals with disabilities. So that means, in theory, 25% of your population that you employ right now are individuals with disabilities. And if you don't have a disabling condition yet or haven't had one at this point, there's a high probability you're going to have one later on while you're working. So I think those are all, if job coaching internal is best practice, but on the other hand, I think just having your trainers and your teams who do the training understand that, and I don't want to go too far down the road in the accommodation side yet, but to be able to understand how to have conversations with people is a big deal. So.
Excellent. I think too, one thing I want to point out about the coaching, Andy, I think we might have talked about this too, is that many times, and we're moving down the path here to the interview, and many times people will want the job coach in the interview with them, or a job coach will say, can I be in the interview with this person? And so I think it's also, we need to be clear on what that role is. And if someone, hiring manager or recruiter has never interviewed someone that has a coach with them, what's kind of some best practice there? Because I think it's just like anybody having an interpreter, you're going to talk to that individual that's applied for your position, not that coach. They may be there for emotional support or whatever the reason is that they give you for being there. It's up to you all to, say, yes, that's a reasonable accommodation or not. So I think that's important to mention.
Yeah, I think that if you have somebody who may be a point of contact for that individual, they may not be a certified job coach. So there are times when a mother or father or a son or daughter or whatever may come along with that person during the interview. To Darla's point, you are interviewing that applicant. But on the other hand, they can be there to help interpret in terms of, maybe I'm, need to restate a question a little bit differently or what have you. I would approach those types of individuals the same way I would a job coach, even though they may not be a job coach, just to set those rules and parameters for expectations moving forward, as well as for the interview itself. So if they're answering for that person, that's not what they're there for. If they're helping interpret, that's fine. But I do think that's, they can't be answering on behalf. The other part about it is if an individual, the job coach feels that they have to stick around in order for that person to be successful, then at that point in time, you may have actually had a bad hire, because the person does have to be able to stand on their own to perform the essential functions of the job. And, I've actually had one organization come to us and say, hey, we've had a job coach here for a while for this employee. I'm like, well, how long have they been there? 10 years. You're like, okay, hold on. So, really sitting back and saying, if you cannot fade and that person cannot perform the jobs without the need of that job coach, then you may want to reevaluate the hire itself. So I know that's a little different twist on it, but the job coach has to be able to fade.
Yeah, good point. All right, Adam, if you want to bring up the next poll, we'll move on to the interview. Everyone gets asked the same questions, myth or fact.
Oh, this will be a tricky one for my HR counterparts.
We're neck and neck.
Oh, I figured it would be
50-50.
right down the middle. All right. So
44 to 56.
44-56. So here's the reality of that. Asking everybody the same questions. I get it, right? A, it's easier. B, it's easier to, quote unquote, legal teams love when we ask the same thing over and over again, and there's no discrepancies. The bottom line is, what are you actually wanting to know? If you are asking questions to find out the same type of information, that's what it really boils down to. Behavior-based interviews for a lot of people, okay, maybe that's fine. But behavior-based interviews for people who may have cognitive disabilities or may not have ever had a job before, to me, it's almost a stacked deck, because really behavior-based interviews have a right answer, they have wrong answers, right? And so if I am asking somebody, and there's an organization I work for, with AMC, if you find a $20 bill on the floor, what would you do with it? It's a behavior, okay, well, the right answer is I'll take it to customer service or give it to a supervisor. The other answer is probably the most honest answer. When we asked 10 individuals with autism that question, they said, I'd put it in my pocket. Now, probably a very honest answer, but not one that actually gets you hired, right? But so we're like, well, wait a second, what are we actually asking? What we're asking is, are you willing to be trained? So we rephrase the question to say, in your training, we'll tell you what to do if you find money or valuables on the floor, which is take it to customer service or take it to a supervisor. Is that something that you are willing to do? And they said, yes. Okay, great. So we basically now solidified the fact the person's willing to be trained versus giving them you have to have a decoder ring on some of these behavior-based questions. And so I think that's really, you don't have to ask the same question as long as you are evaluating the same principles for different people, right? So as long as you're drilling down to find out the same information. Now, I know for a fact, because it's happened, our legal teams will sit there and say, nope, you have to interview every person that gets the same questions. Really? Because if my questions are actually screening out the very people I'm trying to hire, is that right? So I think that's really where you sit back and say, I understand the spirit of the law and the rules, but let's actually sit there and say, what do I need to do to be able to recruit the right talent? So anyway.
That's an excellent point, Andy. And I think sometimes when we make some of those adjustments or changes to those behavioral types of questions, it can be universal. We can make that change, and now that just becomes part of our regular questions for everyone. So we can look at it from both angles, I think, sometimes, right, when it comes to that. The other thing that we wanted to kind of share in this particular area too is around accommodations, and also helping people prepare for an interview. And so we're seeing a lot of best practice around recruiters spending a little extra time with applicants ahead of time. Once they call in and say, they call them for the interview and they schedule that interview, that they're giving some clear instruction of what they can expect for that interview prior to getting there. So it's a little coaching from that recruiter as they share what people can expect coming in. And that can be for everybody too. It doesn't just have to be for people with disabilities, but I think that's a good common best practice that we're seeing a lot more people doing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that with Allied InclusionWorks, with the developing our talent pool, that's one of the things that we do on the front end is here's the expectations, here's the types of interviews that you're going to do. But we also have leveraged a piece of technology where people can actually practice video interviewing. And until such time as they have it where they really like that answer on that one particular question, they can keep trying over and over again. And so I think that's also an accommodation, just to sit there and say, you got one shot to nail it, and you better be good, and you better be in your best state of mind on Wednesday morning when you're sitting in front of people. It's like, oh man, this is going to be really tough. or we could give them opportunities to say, okay, just give me your best answer, the one you feel most comfortable with. And so that's another way of doing and preparing for that interview. I also, Darla, I think it's also really, if you understand somebody or you have somebody sitting in front of you, it's really hard not to ask questions about their condition. It's in the interview, right? It's like, so tell me about XYZ, or whether it be something that's visible, or hey, I pick up on something that maybe there may be a developmental or maybe a traumatic brain injury or something. It's, you know, interviewers themselves are inquisitive people, but on the other hand, it's like you can't, the interview is not about somebody's condition. It's about their ability to do the job.
Yeah, and I think that leads us to making sure that people realize to reach out and ask for assistance in training those that are doing the interviews, so that people feel comfortable asking us, you know, asking whoever's going to be doing that training some of those questions, to say, is it okay to ask, you know, this particular kind of question, and give them a safe space to ask them of the things that they're, you know, they're thinking they're thinking about it, you know, or sometimes they're making, you know, they're making that mistake of asking it in an interview. And so we want to try to help people avoid some of those types of situations, by getting just some basic awareness training, interviewing, those kinds of things when it comes to working and interviewing people with disabilities. You know, the other thing too, oh, go ahead, Andy.
Well, I was just going to say along those same lines is the more training and empowering you can make your interviewers, the better they're going to have to be assessing the talent. And not just into, you know, we keep talking about accommodations are good for everybody, but if I'm asking one question, am I having to go through this entire questionnaire to where it's like I have to ask these questions? I don't give myself any room, or don't give the process any room to actually really interview somebody. You're basically just being a talking head, and somebody's giving you an answer, you're writing it down. But to give people understanding of interviewing people with different skills or different communication styles, or hey, you know what, somebody with autism may not actually look at you in the eye, that's okay. Or maybe you need to rephrase the question. So I think there's something about empowering your interviewers by equipping them with training and understanding of how to interview people with different abilities, because they can really be very nimble, and really assess people, versus getting into an interview and I don't know how to interview this person. It's like, no, that's not an option. You have to be able to. So I think that's one of the big things about, you know, to Darla's point, is when we work with organizations, it's helping their interviewers and helping their hiring managers understand how to interview, because that is, at the end of the day, that is, you know, the one part that can make or break whether that person gets that job, obviously.
Yeah, and as you know, if you've ever been a person that interviews somebody, you know, whether you're a recruiter or hiring manager, whatever your position is, everybody's going to interview different, and not everybody's going to disclose disability. Not everyone's going to disclose that they need accommodation in that interview. You know, you probably have your standard, can you do this, you know, position or this job as it's been explained, with or without accommodations. And there's, you know, most people have some kind of standard question in that interview process. Not everybody that needs an accommodation is going to tell you at that time. So, I mean, hopefully everybody understands that piece, that those requests for accommodations could come later, and they will come later. I mean, you're seeing that, you're experiencing that, I'm sure, as an employer. So I think it's, you know, helpful for us to be able to have a question like that, but just also to realize that not everybody's comfortable with disclosing. And the fact is that just because I have a disability does not mean I have to have an accommodation. So I may not need to request that. If I can meet those qualifications of the job and I can do that as explained to me, it's a mute issue. I don't even need to bring it up.
I think, Darla, you mentioned that, and I think it's one of the first times I actually thought about that. So, yeah, every company has that, or should have that question: can you do this, perform the jobs and essential functional jobs with or without reasonable accommodation? That, if you answer yes, that's great. What happens if they say no? Have we trained our interviewers that what happens if, or yes, but question or answers is like yes, but, and what do they do with that? What can I ask then? Because it's like, I just ran off of a cliff. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do, right? Because that's not in the script. So I think it goes back to, you really do need to have your interviewers trained, because that's just the best practice for anybody. Not just in how to interview and how to code people on their sheets or whatever, but it really is, how do you have a dialogue with somebody who may disclose? So yeah.
Absolutely. And, we talk about this a lot when we do training, is that, we've got this statistics out there. Research shows us that many accommodations cost nothing, but majority on average is around $500 per accommodation. And so we try to share that information because we want people to not be afraid or steer away from selecting a candidate that says, yes, I need an accommodation, versus someone who says, no, I don't. So a lot of accommodations can be maybe a flexible schedule. I think that has proven to be the most requested accommodation that we see out there. And I just want to point out, Andy, I don't know if you saw this or if others have seen this, but the Job Accommodation Network put out a new survey. And even in the times we're in right now in this pandemic, the average, I think it was 56% of employers that they surveyed said that the accommodation requests were no cost or still under that $500 range. And so I think that's something that's real important to make sure people understand, that it's not necessarily going to be this gigantic expense when people request accommodations.
Yeah, and I think the other part about that is 2020 may go down as the year for accommodations across the board, right? I mean, it could be the accommodation, we're making them, and it may not be for a disabling condition. It could be for the fact that, hey, I have to work from home. The whole idea of remote working has been a great accommodation for all of us. And by the way, the businesses have won because they've been able to accommodate with technology or what have you, or those flexible schedules. But I do think that being able to have a conversation with somebody about what they really need to be successful in the job, and making that just okay, that's a retention strategy. Because as we mentioned earlier, you may acquire a disabling condition while you're working. And so being able to have that conversation with somebody to vet out what the real need is, or they may not even know. Because the other part about accommodation is, a lot of people say, a lot of organizations believe that if you are the individual with disability, you're the one that has to ask for an accommodation. Well, that's a myth, because of the fact that really the bottom line is, I'm trying to give you a job aid to help you be successful, right? We've gone through a lot of expense. We've gone through a lot of time to train you, find you, train you, get you onboarded. So what do you need to do to be successful? And so you don't have to talk about the condition itself. Well, I can see you can't see very well anymore. No, it's like, hey, are you having a hard time reading the screen? If so, we can get you a bigger screen, get you some software or what have you. But that's really what a supervisor is designed to do, not necessarily be the productivity police, but to sit back and say, if you're losing productivity, how do we get that back? And so having that interactive process that we talk about in HR and that sort of stuff, it's a dialogue. It's to be able to ask, and people be uncomfortable that let's talk about what you need. And I think when we talk about accommodations, it automatically kicks it into some sort of legal realm, the accommodation. So I have to go, well, really it's a job aid. What do you need to be successful at your job? And I think once we've changed that verbiage a little bit, it makes things a little easier to have a conversation about. So versus thinking I'm getting myself in trouble.
Yeah, that's so true. I think that's a really, really important parts to remember. I think too, it goes back to that training that you mentioned, training interviewers, and that dialogue we're all going to experience different things and may not get trained in a particular, answering a particular question, but I think the more training we can and throwing out some of those scenarios can be helpful. I heard one the other day where someone was concerned about one of their employees being stressed and was worried that, you know, maybe the workload is piling up. The person was not handling or coping real well, and so maybe there was increased anxiety along with the stress. And the concern of the supervisor was that, hey, this person hasn't taken any time off lately, so I think that they're really stressed. But the way we say that to somebody can make the biggest difference. So you as a supervisor, you wouldn't say, gosh, you're really stressed. Are you having anxiety issues? You know, but more so, you know, I noticed you haven't taken time off lately. Are you planning on any vacation coming up? But relate it back to performance. You know, are you feeling overwhelmed? Is the workload, you know, how's your workload right now? You know, questions like that, that's not going to point out to, I think you're having problems, you know, those kinds of things. So, yeah. All right. So as you can see on this roadmap, we're leaving the interviewing piece into onboarding. So now we're assuming that the person has been hired and moving into the onboarding piece. So our question, everyone gets onboarded with the same process. Myth or fact? Okay, it looks about 75% myth, 25% fact. We love throwing in a little bit of tricky questions, right, Andy?
Yeah, a little twist is always good. So yes, obviously people need to be onboarded, and we can have our processes, but people may be onboarded differently. And I think that's one of the big. It's a big barrier to, okay, we've gone through this entire roadmap thus far, and now we're onboarding. They're on the job. Okay, great. So they're coming on the job, but they only stick around for 2 weeks. Well, what happened? Was it our onboarding process? You know, we talk about, you know, onboarding could be the training. Onboarding is not necessarily a snapshot in time. Somebody asked me the other day, is like, when do people stop being onboarded? And I said, well, the biggest thing I would always say is people can stop being quote unquote in the onboarding phase of their job when they can then turn around and onboard somebody else, right? And so I think that changes the time frame, right? Onboarding, some people say it's a week. Sometimes you get 3 days of onboarding. But really, onboarding is it's part of that journey of your employment. So it's until such time as you can turn around and onboard somebody else, you should still be considered in the onboarding phase. And so when we talk about onboarding with somebody with a disability, first of all, prepare their team, right? If it's a disability or whatever, prepare. The team doesn't necessarily say, hey, by the way, Andy's coming in and you know, he uses a wheelchair. You don't necessarily need to tell people I'm gonna be in a wheelchair or I use a wheelchair, because they're gonna find that out. But how do we prepare them for being helpful? How do you prepare them for what do I do? What do I say? What don't I do? What don't I say? Type of interaction. And so I think I know there's a stigma, there's a fear of what happens if. And so again, you're going to hear there's a theme that runs through a lot of what Darla and I say, and a lot of it has to deal with training, giving people knowledge, and once they have knowledge, they can be empowered. And so, you know, understanding, you know, how to work around somebody with a disability. You don't have to know what that condition does to Andy, and I'm not going to go in and say Andy uses a wheelchair for this reason. It's more of, when you have a conversation with Andy, don't tower over him and look down on him, because it puts his neck in a weird spot and it's just very uncomfortable. Why don't you just grab a chair and have a seat and talk to him? so I think it's just preparing them. And like I said, that's how you prepare teams. You prepare them to do the right things on the job, because people just they want to interact. They want to do what's right, but on the other hand, they don't want to do what's wrong and screw up. And that's the biggest thing that prevents them from doing anything. So if I don't communicate with somebody, I can't communicate badly. I just don't communicate. And that's not a good process either. So I think in the onboarding process, it's preparing the teams that that individual is going to be working around or working with.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think in that preparation, Andy, that we talked a little bit about any kind of materials or the way the materials are delivered in that orientation and training piece. You know, the job expectations, those kinds of things I think are important, but also just some of the things that maybe we may take for granted, just, you know, orientating someone to the building or their workspace, their coworkers, where's the lunchroom, what do people do for lunch, you know, if I am using a wheelchair, where's the accessible restroom versus maybe one that's not so accessible, you know, things like that. If my workspace is on a upper floor, where's the elevator versus the stairs, you know, stuff like that I think is real crucial. And then we talked about, you know, whether someone has a mentor program already set up in their, you know, in their business to make sure that that person is there initially, that's going to be kind of with them that, you know, first few days, I don't know, a few weeks, depending on how much time the person needs, but just who's that go-to person for them, that they can, you know, depend on. And especially if a person does have a job coach with them, how is that person getting, you know, familiar with the job? Is that in advance? Is it the same day? You know, those kinds of things.
Darla, you mentioned the buddy system earlier, and I think that's a really great thing that the businesses really need to embrace more so. I mean, there are mentor programs and they are fantastic, but a mentor almost implies the fact that somebody further in, you know, above their pay grade or a different person within their hierarchy of the business has to be involved, which is always, it's obviously welcome. My apologies for the horn going off. Sorry, but I think the other part about it is to be able to have somebody who is there, who's close by, who maybe just somebody who works right next with the person, who is the designated buddy to be able to help the person out, to kind of help them, show them where the lunchroom is and that sort of stuff, versus a really formalized mentor program. It's like, no, it's just some people want to do, you know, they want to help. So empower somebody to be that person for that individual. And so I think that, you know, it doesn't need to be overly complicated. It's just basically giving somebody a buddy to help them navigate a lot of the day-to-day stuff. You know, even ask those questions of, you know, do people bring lunch or do you go to lunch? Or, you know, when should I take a lunch? Because I like to eat at 11:30, but if the culture is everybody eats at 1 o'clock or 12:30, great. I just want to know, so I'm not, you know, going later, going early or whatever. So I think that buddy system to me has been a game changer in a lot of organizations, just to not overcomplicate it, but give people the accommodation they need. Yeah,
exactly. I have a little quick story about kind of that same situation for an employment job I started a while. This is many years ago, but you know, we see people in most cultures, most work environments, we see people bubble up as some of those natural, you know, buddies or, you know, folks that want to help out. I started a new job once and this person just, oh yeah, I'll show her around, no big deal. And I was getting the lay of the land where everything was. And oh yeah, here's the break room. And oh, here's the coffee machine. Now, coffee is real important to all of us around here. And we share every week, someone buys the coffee. And oh yeah, this is your week. So, that was my orientation. It's like, oh, I better bring the coffee. So sometimes you get tricked.
Yeah, understood.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to the next question then, Adam. Performance management. We could spend probably the rest of the time on this, huh? Myth or fact, I can address the disability impact in job performance conversation.
I can address the disability impact in job performance conversations.
Looks like we've got
Tricky.
64% myth, 36% fact. Oh, it just jumped again, 58% versus 42.
All right, so we're pretty much down the middle on this one. So the trick part about that question is that I can address the disability impact in job performance conversations. What we're stating is the fact that do not necessarily bring up the condition. It's about the job performance, right? So it's not about your disability. It's about the impact in your performance. And so if that is a situation, we talked earlier about accommodations, we talked about, you know, how you can suggest accommodations or job aids or what have you, but you want to make sure you're talking about performance of the job. And that's really what it boils down to. Again, we talk about the same job, same pay, same expectations. And so it's about you're not meeting expectations in the job. And what do we need to do? What do we need to, you know, I'm not going to come out and say, do you need accommodations, but what do you need to be successful? That's what it is. And not necessarily saying, you know, Andy, you know, you have such and such condition that's preventing you from being successful. That's not what we go into. It is more of what do I need in order to perform my job. But I also think it's very important that we get real-time feedback, obviously, and that's an HR 101 piece, but especially for individuals who have barriers or may have barriers that come up, it's to provide that real-time feedback. You know, by the way, if they're not hitting a certain productivity number and you're a metrics-driven organization and they can see their numbers, it's not a surprise to them they're not hitting their numbers. It's not a surprise to them that they're struggling. What's going to be a surprise is how long it's going to take for somebody to come along and say, what can we do to help you become more successful? And so make sure it's real-time feedback that you're giving the individual. Some people call it just-in-time feedback. Yeah, well, just-in-time, you need to give it to them. So I think that's very important. But feedback doesn't have to be always this formal, come in, sit down, and do a performance review. It could just be, you know, informal as well, right? And I've always told people, it's like, if you wait until you're sitting down and say, we're going to schedule something out for a week and a half, well, if they're struggling in the job, do you actually think they may actually make it a week and a half before they can actually get to you to have a conversation? So it's like, make sure it's timely, make sure it's in a way that they can communicate. Sometimes these formal or informal conversations, people want to have them on the floor, right? Or I'm going to do it if I'm in a warehouse situation. Let's just have a conversation, right? I can grab you. Let's talk about it right here, right now. Well, how about stepping into a break room to where you can actually have a conversation, you minimize distractions, people can be heard, and that sort of stuff. So I think it's really understanding that feedback loop has got to be on a regular basis.
Yeah, excellent point. I think to that, also just want to make sure we don't avoid giving feedback. So if we're seeing something occurring, that we don't want to ignore it. I mean, you wouldn't for anybody else. So don't make exceptions. Like you mentioned, same expectations for people with disabilities as you do for people who don't. And so I think that's you know, even a more crucial point in this performance management piece. The other piece is too, is that, and I guess we're going to talk about this next with advancement, but that comes into play too when we're talking about performance management. So anytime someone's looking at, you know, advancement or promotion opportunities. I think another good question, we didn't ask this, but do we supervise people the same? Does everybody have, you know, do we supervise everybody the same way? That could be a myth or fact question as well. We know we don't supervise everybody the same way. Again, we have processes that we follow. We have disciplinary action processes that we follow. but the way we interact with people and the way we supervise is not the same. So we have to get to know people. And I think as supervisors, not to sound like a broken record, but we need training as well when we're in supervisory positions or management positions to know how to work with different people in different ways.
I think it's interesting though, Darla. You know, we talk to hiring managers all the time and supervisors, and I think one of the parts is that they may delay giving feedback because they don't want to sound like a bad guy, right? It's like, oh boy, I really, so I went from somehow maintaining the same job, same pay, same expectations to, I really like this person. This person's, I mean, boy, if we can do good and we can actually give them an opportunity to make a paycheck and all this other stuff, and we're just doing good, I understand that philosophy, but I also will be the first to chastise it, to say, if you're doing it because you think you're going to feel good about this, you understand how bad you and that individual are going to feel when this thing runs aground, because it will. You can't maintain people on your payroll who are underperforming, or other people know they're underperforming. You're going to have to terminate, and that's okay. I mean, I love doing this type of training, when we're in person. I have people raise their hand. How many people have ever had a job that they weren't qualified for? It's like, right? I mean, me and landscaping, do not get me around anything green that's like alive, because it's not going to work. I mean, I killed just about everything. So, I tried landscaping in college, and I thankfully was career counseled out of that industry. But it's okay, right? And terminate if needed, and make sure it's for the right reasons. And they can't, it's about the expectations, meeting the essential functions of the job, meeting productivity standards. It's okay. But if you keep people on, it can be really, it can have more problems internally than just that one individual.
Absolutely. If you make those exceptions, others see it, and that's
right.
You're exactly right. It's going to lead to a lot more. All right. We want to move to the next.
Yep.
Last one. Okay. Myth or fact? People with disabilities are just happy to have a job and don't care about promotions. Right. I think we have 100% myth.
Good. Whew, that's good.
Ooh.
That's great. Yeah.
Excellent. It's so great to land on a good note like that, right?
Yeah. I think the great part about that is that from what we've been talking about today, and certainly I think we have a lot of early adopters in disability employment and such, probably listening in today and watching. But I would say that is actually the advancement part is one of the holy grails to disability employment, because our hiring managers are like, hey, the person's working and they're doing a good job, right? So it's like, how do I have conversations about opportunities with people within their job? What's the next step? That might require some education, right? And they may not understand what the next step is, but if they are qualified for it, I think it's a shame when businesses don't engage that individual with what can your next step be, or at least educating them, and not sitting there saying you're ready now, but here's something else to think about, right? And I think that's really something that we need to do better as corporations and industries and hiring managers and HR people and all of us in this space, is that people unfortunately get hired on and they turn into park and stays, right? They get parked in one and they stay there forever. We need to be certainly understanding, giving them opportunities for training. And if you're a federal contractor, we all know the fact that there's so many different rules and regulations with 503 and documenting things. But if you're doing training for everybody, why would you exclude somebody, right? So I think there's a certain amount of, you've been invited into our company, you're here, you're producing just like everybody else is. So why would I not give you the same training opportunities as other people? Why would I not give you the same advancement opportunities as other people? And so I think that's really kind of where we went from an inclusive to an exclusive culture. And I think that's a shame that we've seen, that we've, and unfortunately it's happened quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think sometimes if we see somebody in the same position and they haven't initiated interest in moving into a position, like, we've talked about, you got to ask people. I mean, it's not always enough just to present, hey, here's an opportunity, but hey, here's an opportunity, you might think about applying for it. Because sometimes just those simple words is really going to go a long ways. I know I had many years ago, I had a supervisor ask me, hey, Darla, have you ever thought about getting your master's degree? And I was like, no, why would I want to do that? But that was the nudge that I needed to then go ahead and look to try to get my master's degree. And of course I did, but sometimes it's just that one person making that suggestion that, hey, if they think I can do it, maybe I can. And so many times people may not have thought that for themselves, or even think that they might be, interested in a position. So, and again, we mentioned it's not always about position, but responsibilities and any kinds of groups I could lead or be a leader of, or co-chair. Those kinds of things I think are really, really important.
Yeah, even in the performance review piece, a lot of performance reviews and best practices, setting aside one, maybe two key performance indicators that the individual actually owns. So it's like you're having a conversation with them. It's like, what do you want to get out of your next year or next quarter or whatever that is? And that's a great time to have conversations about what if, or have you thought about, or let's explore, or whatever. So I think having those KPIs where they can do certain things in professional development, they should still be learning just like anybody else is. And so having those down so they can address those is a big piece, because then it also holds the company accountable to making sure that that individual is getting what they need. So I think the performance management time is a great time to start talking, or even, laying some groundwork for potential advancement.
Absolutely. And I know this, we didn't talk about this, and this might be a pain point for some people, but I know when I was a supervisor, manager, director, I sometimes coached my employees to move on from our place of business. If we didn't have the promotional opportunities for them and they wanted that, so it may be a pain point for some, like, oh, we don't want to lose them, but it's good to help coach people on to the next area or next desire that they have in terms of employment or career advancement. So. All right, I think we should think about opening up for question and answer. I don't know, Greg, if that's something that you want to help facilitate, or where we're at in terms of questions. But
yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Darla. Thank you, Andy. We actually have a couple of questions in the chat function. And so I think this might go back to one of the earlier conversations. But from a candidate perspective, what are some of the key best practices to think about from a recruitment process perspective? And this person apologizes; she might have come in a little late. Hopefully, she's still in the audience.
So, can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What's the actual question?
From the candidate's perspective, what are some of the key best practices to think about from a recruitment process perspective?
So I would say part of the finding candidates would be to open up your aperture in which you're looking and posting your jobs. Where am I putting my job announcements? There certainly, Disability In is one that I would encourage people to put their job postings on, and work with Disability In. The more organizations that you can reach out to, the community outreach and community engagement is one way to do it. But I think that one of the biggest parts is that you have to, if you're going after a certain type of candidates, you have to be prepared for when the candidates come in. It's not a matter of just sending out an email and hoping the candidates show up, because then what do you do if? and what do you do when they show up? And so I think it goes back to the training. If you're, say, hey, we're going to be disability friendly, that's great, but you need to provide more training for your interviewers and that sort of stuff. So I think that's really, leveraging different technologies to help get your job postings out. And so, I'll let Darla certainly, they have a great tool that they use. Certainly with Allied, we have about 47 different organizations that we work with around the metro area to help provide candidates. But Darla, you want to kind of give a little bit idea about what you have within yours?
Yeah, so we do have an online job board. It's called Our Ability Connect, and companies can utilize that to scrape their positions. And when businesses come in partnership with us, they have unlimited postings on that site. If I'm kind of thinking about your question a little bit more too, though, it kind of sounds like preparing recruiters. We talked a little bit about that, how you help prepare those candidates. So maybe I'm reading too much into this question, but it seems like we talked a little bit about that from the recruiter perspective. How can you help that candidate be prepared more for the interview? And I think that's a really great best practice. It's how do you look at letting them know what are the expectations? What is the process for the interview? Where is it located? How do they access your building? And even now, most interviews are being done virtually. How do they prepare for a virtual interview? What do they need to consider in terms of the background noise? I'm going to point that out since we are hearing some background noise. I'm just making fun, Andy, sorry. But there, that's a real thing, because a while ago my dogs were barking and I was going, oh, I hope people can't hear that. So in an interview, I want to be less distracted, right? So recruiters can help prepare people for that. Try to find a quiet space, make sure test your camera and audio ahead of time, make sure your lighting's good. I mean, things like that in the virtual interview process that we can help them prepare for. If I've already disclosed to you that I'm a person that uses a wheelchair, then maybe to put me at ease, you could explain to me where I access the front door. It has access to, help me get in. It has automatic doors, or whatever you feel can help me prepare more for the interview, I think is going to be best practice.
Very good. Well, I think, Darla, that you actually answered the second follow-up that one of our attendees had. So okay. Thank you very much. And I don't believe that there are any more questions. But thank you so much again. You guys can have probably an all-day conversation with all the great information you share with our attendees. I want to tell all the attendees, thank you for attending today. Thank you for attending our previous sessions. We hope that you've enjoyed them and that you are able or capable of going back to your organizations and practicing some of these strategies that not only Andy and Darla have told you about, but all the other workshops that we've had in this past year. We're definitely looking forward to next year, as we will get continue the series of workshops starting in February with, I believe, our workshop on implicit bias. And so with that, I'd love to thank everybody for attending today, and hopefully we'll see you again very soon. Happy Thanksgiving and have a good one. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.